is a prerequisite here to get low carbon energy supply in place. But let's be blunt about it, it won't penetrate the system significantly in the West until probably 2030. And at the current rate of implementing these things, it won't be probably till 2050 or 2100. So we need to make some radical shifts on demand whilst we put the supply infrastructure in place. Both are enormously challenging. So why is it this is very different from what you normally get to hear? This is not what we normally hear in the press. Now, I think it's changing. Certainly it's changing in terms of the scale of the problem, but I think not in terms of yet being able to countenance the answers. Inconsistency in 2 degrees C. Remember before I said that we're holding to 2 degrees C. That's the language, hold to 2 degrees C. Why is that language important? Well, that language suggests we actually have agreed internationally, repeatedly internationally now, to say that we want a very small chance of exceeding 2 degrees C. And if you follow the language of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that suggests a less than 10% chance of exceeding dangerous climate change, as we've characterised it. Now that probability, the maths here is quite important. The UK government is signed up to a 63% chance of exceeding 2 degrees C. That's its own numbers, so it accepts that. The difference between a 10 and a 63% chance is enormous. Basically what we're interested in here is the carbon budget, the area under those curves I just showed. And the carbon budget for a 63% chance of exceeding 2 degrees C is twice as large as that for a 10%. So by massaging the percentages, you dramatically change your rates of mitigation, what you have to do in terms of policy to bring emissions down. Now that's lost in the subtleties of the argument a lot of the time, but it's absolutely pivotal. It's not just twice as demanding, because we've already used most of the budget. It takes you from sort of incremental changes that will be quite challenging to radical, almost overnight type changes, which are much more profound than that. So at the moment, the UK government's legally binding commitments under the Act, effectively, those budgets are twice the size of those that we repeatedly sign up to internationally. So we're telling poor parts of the world something very different to what we're doing at home. And we're no different to every other country. Let's be blunt. I'm not just complaining about Britain here. And many other countries are in a similar position, though to some extent we have carbon budgets as many other countries don't. So we are ahead of the curve on that level. And so these implications of this are actually profound, and profound for Manchester, for this committee. It's also worth bearing in mind the sort of language we always hear, which unfortunately is not what we're hearing all the time from Manchester, and indeed is changing in the UK now. These large reductions, 80% reductions by 2050, which has nothing to do with climate change. There's no science behind that, despite the fact we hear it all the time. The carbon dioxide for keeping the lights on here and keeping these screens running will be affecting the climate for 100 to 10,000 years. Somewhere about 20% of the carbon dioxide to keep those screens on will be there for possibly up to 10,000 years. So we're changing the climate for some time to come. And that tends to suggest that actually what matters are the build-up, to tell us very clearly, is the build-up of CO2 that matters. And from a policy perspective, that's completely different. That takes us from the idea that the timeline allows us to think about nuclear power and wind turbines as the solution to actually have to do something immediately. Wind turbines, nuclear power, low carbon energy supply, all sorts, biofuels, carbon capture and storage, all those things are important, but you have to get yourself off the curve quickly, and that means urgent and radical reductions, which of course as policymakers, as society, as businesses, none of us particularly like, because that changes to what we do today from what we should have done yesterday. So where's this leave us? 2 degrees C looks difficult, I think it would be fair to say. So we think that, well, okay, we can't do 2 degrees C, what about 4 degrees C future? Well, just to hand through very quickly, this is work taken from the UK's Hadley Centre based in the Met Office, and indeed some of the contributions from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. A 4 degrees C global average, that includes all of the planet, that includes the oceans, which take a long time to warm up. So we're talking about 5 to 6 degrees C warming on land, which again, if you live in Manchester, may not sound too bad, and if you live in some parts of Russia, maybe it's not so bad as well. But you think, well, what's the impact of that regionally on, say, the hottest days, the 2003 heatwave, where 20 to 30,000 people died across Europe? Firstly, if you think of someone like China, which has an infrastructure which is not designed to actually deal with these massive changes in temperature, and the one they're putting up today certainly isn't designed for that. You're talking about 6 to 8 degrees C rise. In the middle of a heat wave that might last for 2 weeks or 2 months, we're talking about a rise in temperature of 6 to 8 degrees in China. In Central Europe, imagine our Victorian infrastructure here trying to cope with next to 8 to 10 degrees. The tube won't be working, some of the streets, the tarmac will be melting, the amount of power you can put to the cables to transmit power to your fridges and houses to keep your food cold will be reduced because the soil moisture will drop in the land, in the ground, which means you can't put as much power through the cables, so some of the fridges will go off. So during the time of the heat wave, the fridges will be off, there'll be less power coming through to keep your air conditioning cool, so people will start to die at faster rates. So we have that infrastructure in place at the moment, and this is the sort of future we're heading towards here. And also similar in North America. Basically around the globe you see very large regional changes, and it's the regional adjustments that really matter. It's the extremes that matter in terms of this sort of side. You're also seeing low latitudes, Big reductions in food crops, huge uncertainties with this stuff, to be honest, but basically the main crops will be significantly reduced at the same time as the population around the globe, particularly in those parts of the world, is heading up towards 9 billion. So if you poll, anecdotally, as I've been doing for many years now, but pretty much a lot of people are saying this quite clearly now, including the Committee on Climate Change, 4°C future is incompatible with organised global community as far as we can understand. We reach the Kalashnikov, not the debating table, when we try to have such scarce resources. It is beyond what many parts of the world will be able to adapt to. They'll be able to adapt to it by dying, or by living really very low quality lives. We may struggle over here, but the poor parts of the world will really struggle. It's devastating to ecosystems. We'll lose things like Barrier Reef, but we'll also, at 4, 5, 6 degrees C, we'll start to lose all of the major ecosystems that we're aware of. They'll change to something else, but that will take centuries, if not millennia, to really evolve and become static or stable again. And there's a high likelihood that actually we'll tip the system to a new place. So this is just the normal way of looking at it. It is likely to go beyond that. So we need to avoid 4°C at all costs. We cannot go there. It's absolutely incumbent on this committee, on the council, on us internationally, across the globe now, to actually say we cannot go to 4°C. What do we need to avoid that future? So returning to 2, these are the sorts of reduction rates that we need to be looking at. 10% per annum reductions year on year for the wealthy parts of the world. And really, this was from 2011 analysis. It's got much worse since 2011. Emissions have just keep rising well above what people thought they would. So a 40% reduction in emissions by 2015, about 70% by 2020, and 90%, basically no carbon in the system, in the energy, not electricity system, the energy system for wealthy parts of the world, to give the poor parts of the world a small opportunity to expand their emissions. Remember, the government's programme at the moment on climate change is premised on India and China peaking its emissions in 2017. 2017 for India and China to peak its emissions. That is not going to happen. And yet our policies here are premised on that assumption, and no one spoke to the Indians and Chinese about that. Now this is impossible, but then 4°C is impossible as well. So the future has become impossible. We've actually done nothing about this. Just us here collectively at a global level, we've done nothing about this. So we've put ourselves into a position where we don't know how to get out of it. That's not an excuse for despair, though. I think there's plenty more we can think about this, but at the moment our way of thinking is not helping us. So my question then is, have we got the agency to get out of this? We need unprecedented reductions and probably develop systems that actually can adapt to very significant levels of climate change linked to outside chance of 2°C. Stern, the Committee on Climate Change, and many other economists say that, well, point out very clearly that mitigation of over 4% per annum, so reducing your emissions over 4% per annum, is incompatible with economic growth. In fact, Stern has actually said there's only ever been 1% per annum reductions that have gone with any significant improvement. So we have no precedent for how to achieve this. But at the same time, I would argue, if you look at the economy now, certainly across the western part of the world, if not some other parts of the world as well, that our economy has stalled. Self-regulated markets, as was noted in the US Congress on this, they're not self-regulating. All the structures that we thought were supporting our system have actually started to collapse. We've put in £350 here, that's a slight mistake, £350 billion, a slightly larger number, into quantitative easing. And that's failed to even trigger a lot of change. The Joseph Ramsey Foundation reckons that 290 billion would retrofit every house in the UK. We should have given it to them rather than the banks thing. We have an unprecedented opportunity now to think differently, because the world is having to think differently, regardless of climate change. The structures around us are making us think differently. That's a real opportunity for us here and for the committee. Growth it's not an ideology, it's a dogma, I think, now it's become to. But let's not say it's a bad or a good thing, but it's a proxy for social goods. No one's interested in growth. What they're interested in are welfare, health, life expectancy, love for your children, good quality education, those things. Employment or income, we're interested in those things. We're interested in equity, we're interested in literacy rates, and all of these sorts of things, a whole suite of things. They're what we're interested in, and we use growth as a proxy for those. And actually I think that's quite unhelpful, because growth itself doesn't matter one way or the other. What matters are the real things in life. And let's measure them and see what we can do about those. And it may mean you have a growing economy, it may not. In a sense, the growth itself is an irrelevance. And actually, I would say a hindrance to the way we think about these issues. So you could argue in Manchester that we should have a programme of, I would suggest here, this is some suggestions about how we may think about this. If we had a major programme of greening Manchester's built environment and infrastructure, could that help improve all of these? 350 billion has been spent on the banks. As I pointed out, we could have done a tremendous amount with that. We could have converted the whole of UK's infrastructure to be the green infrastructure for that much money. Retrofit Manchester's housing stock. Well, that reduces energy use and emissions. It's quite costly, but at the same time, it helps you with employment. So you start to see some real synergies, some real win-wins here. And you have to think quite differently about this. Not only is it if you retrofit, is that